Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we're doing Commander's Guild deck number 203 and it's titled Jaheira, Detective of the Forest. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So, this week our random card is completely random, and it is going to be Jaheira, Friend of the Forest. And Jaheira is 2 and a green for a 2/3 legendary creature human elf druid. Tokens you control have tap, add a green, and of course choose a background. So as you may be able to guess, since Jaheira is our random card, and therefore technically going to also be our commander, given our, unspoken rule that any legendary creature should be our commander, that means we of course have to add a background. We can't just have Jaheira without a background. I mean, we could, but that would kind of limit what we want to do. So we are adding a background this week. So Jaheira is going to be combined with Clan Crafter to give us a Simic deck, and Clan Crafter is 1 and a blue for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have pay 2, sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and draw a card. Now, you may be wondering, why Clan Crafter? What is it about Jaheira and tokens that works well with Clan Crafter and artifacts? And to kind of answer that question, let's jump into our themes, talk about some of what we're doing with this deck, and of course our major theme, which is going to combine our two, is going to be clues. We are focusing very heavily on clue tokens and investigating because of a very specific interaction between clues and Jaheira. So you may notice that a clue has the ability to sacrifice itself for 2 mana to draw a card. Now, normally, a lot of artifact tokens have to tap themselves in order to sacrifice themselves to draw a card, or in the effect of blood tokens get to draw and discard, or treasures get to make mana. Clues do not have that restriction. Clues do not need to tap themselves in order to draw, so if our clues can tap for green mana with Jaheira, because she specifies token, not creature token, we can then tap 2 clues to sacrifice one of the tapped clues to draw a card, essentially giving us a huge mana advantage and card advantage as we go through the game. With that being said, we do have some cards that care very heavily about investigating in clues, such as Floodhound, which is a blue for a 1/2 elemental dog, and you can pay 3, tap it, and investigate. Giving us a repeatable way to investigate is incredibly important in this deck because we need to be able to generate as much mana with our tokens, and therefore as many tokens as possible as we go through the game. That is, of course, not our only theme with the deck. So moving into our second theme, we're going to have other artifact tokens. There are a lot of ways to generate additional artifact tokens when we're talking about investigating and making clues. One good example of that is Peregrine Took, which is 2 and a green for a 2/3 legendary creature halfling citizen. If one or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus an additional food token are created instead. Then you can sacrifice 3 foods and draw a card. With that in mind, we can use Floodhound, for example, investigate, make a clue, and then with Peregrine in play, we would then also make a food token, giving us a lot of different ways to generate these artifact tokens that can all tap for mana thanks to Jaheira, and can also be sacrificed with Clan Crafter to be able to draw cards, essentially turning even our foods into clue tokens. And then, finally, of course, we get to our last theme of the deck, and this one is going to be drawing cards. Since we intend on having so many clues, and therefore probably drawing a ton of cards, we may as well play into that with the cards that say, whenever you draw your second card. That's going to give us this ability to just kind of play our deck, do what we want to do, go through our game plan, and get to the point where we're drawing, hopefully, at least 2 cards a turn to trigger something like Emrakul's Messenger, which is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 Eldrazi Fairy Rogue. It's devoid, it has flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add a colorless. You may notice at this point, Emrakul's Messenger, once again, makes another token. Now, we can sacrifice the Eldrazi spawn, but we can also tap it for a green mana. That means that pretty much every Eldrazi spawn creature token we're making makes us a green and a colorless mana because it can tap for a green and then sacrifice itself for a colorless. So we have ways to generate an absurd amount of mana with this deck, and then just kind of channel that into our clues to draw pretty much our entire deck. So with that in mind, those are all of our themes for this week. And the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some key cards. These are cards that synergize really well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions or maybe value pieces all on their own. So the very first key card that I would like to highlight is going to be Academy Manufactor. And I'm sure if you have ever played a clue deck or food or treasure deck, you've probably seen this card before. It is 3 mana for a 1/3 artifact creature assembly worker. If you would create a clue, food, or treasure token, instead create one of each. So if we make, say, 1 clue, we then get a clue, a food, and a treasure. But if we would make, say, 5 clues, we then make 5 clues, 5 food, and 5 treasure. So again, keeping in mind that we want to have Jaheira in play, meaning that generating just a single clue, which then turns into the clue, the food, and the treasure, generates us 3 green mana, which can immediately be pumped into the clue, into the food, to be able to draw cards, gain life, or maybe even cast some of our other spells. So Academy Manufactor is incredibly powerful, and definitely one of those cards that if it hits the board, it actually becomes kind of difficult not to win the game. So keep that in mind if you decide to cast an Academy Manufactor. Moving on, though, to our second key card. This one is going to be Forensic Gadgeteer. And Forensic Gadgeteer, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 Vidalcan Artificer Detective. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, investigate. And while that ability is pretty effective and pretty good, it's not really the reason we're playing it. Yes, we'll probably get some artifacts off of it, and therefore some clues, but the real reason it's here is for its second ability. Activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1. So if we can do our math properly here, we'll notice that a clue has an activated ability of pay 2, sacrifice this artifact. By being able to reduce it by 1, it is now 1 mana to sacrifice it and draw a card. Jaheira lets our clues tap for a green mana, meaning that every single clue can actually just sacrifice itself. We can tap it for a green and use that same mana to sacrifice a clue, essentially turning every single one of our clues into a free card draw, which is incredibly powerful and kind of difficult to interact with because there's not much our opponents can do to stop us from just drawing a ton of cards. If they try to board wipe artifacts, we draw a ton of cards. They try to board wipe creatures, we draw a ton of cards. So Forensic Gadgeteer, while it's kind of unique in its own way and can be a good value piece, it is kind of what allows us to pop off later in the game and puts us in a position where we've drawn so many cards, we'll definitely find either an answer to something or maybe even a win condition even after a board wipe resolves. So Forensic Gadgeteer, definitely worth the include. And then last but not least, our final key card is Rise and Shine. So we've talked a lot about generating a ton of mana, we've talked a lot about generating a ton of tokens and a ton of card draw, but we haven't mentioned a win condition. The vast majority of our win conditions are going to come from effects like Rise and Shine, of course, being the most efficient way to do it and for the cheapest price, because it is 1 and a blue for a sorcery. Target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 0/0 artifact creature. Put 4 +1/+1 counters on each artifact that became a creature this way. Or, and most importantly, it has overload for 4 blue. So for 6 mana, we can turn every single artifact non-token, or non-creature token, I suppose I should say, into a 4/4. It's not unreasonable that we have 15, maybe even 20 clues in play at any given time. So we can just generate 15 to 20 4/4 creatures that presumably don't necessarily need haste because they've been in play and can attack out of nowhere, surprising our opponents and just winning us the game on the spot. So while we don't really intend to draw our entire deck and win with things like Laboratory Maniac, we do want to try to win through combat, so we do need Rise and Shine and other effects like it to really put the pressure on our opponents. That, though, brings us to the end of our key card section, and the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. And these are cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some cases are value engines, or maybe just fun cards that I want to highlight. So the first pair of cards that I want to talk about is going to be between Innocuous Researcher and Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. So this is kind of another highlight of individual cards, because I do think that both of these cards are very powerful and very impressive in this deck in general, but they actually interact very well together as well. So first up, Innocuous Researcher, 3 and a green for a 3/4 Centaur Detective. It has Parlay, so whenever it attacks, each player reveals the top card of their library. For each non-land card revealed this way, you investigate, then each player draws a card, and at the beginning of your end step, you may untap all lands you control, but if you do, you can't cast spells until your next turn. So that doesn't normally sound like it's going to be a great ability, but when we're generating so many clues, and if our lands are going to be tapped anyway, we may as well untap them so we can then activate our abilities and draw cards from our clues and from other things. So Innocuous Researcher kind of on the surface looks a little bit strange, but is actually very powerful in this deck. And then it's even more powerful when combined with Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, which is a green and a blue for a 2/2 human druid. Whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. This, once again, is another way to have our clues just sacrifice themselves, because they would tap for 2 green mana and can then immediately sacrifice themselves to draw a card. But if we're talking about pairing it up with Innocuous Researcher, the real thing we want to look at is Kinnan's second ability. And that second ability is 5 green blue. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a non-human creature card from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. While the Innocuous Researcher says that we can't cast spells, it says nothing about activating abilities. And Kinnan's activated ability is a very powerful way to put our creatures into play. And yeah, we're probably spending more mana than we need to put those creatures into play, but that's worth it when you consider that we probably weren't casting spells otherwise, and we may not have had the mana without Innocuous Researcher. But that is, I think, enough about our first cool interaction. So we're going to move on to our second pair of cards, and these ones are going to be For the Common Good and Inspiring Statuary. So for the common good, XX green for a sorcery, create X tokens that are copies of target token you control. Then tokens you control gain indestructible until your next turn, and you gain 1 life for each token you control. So essentially, if we have Jaheira in play, that means we have, we'll say, 6 tokens. We can tap all 6 tokens, make 6 green mana, and then for whatever much mana we have, in this case we're just assuming we only have the 1 green, we can pay 3, 3, and a green, and make 3 copies of a token we control, which is probably going to be a clue. The important part here is that we do need a way to have them generate mana, and sometimes Jaheira doesn't make it around the table. Once people realize how powerful she is with clues, she usually winds up in the command zone pretty frequently. So we need to make sure we have backup versions of Jaheira, which is where Inspiring Statuary comes in. Mainly because Inspiring Statuary is 3 mana for an artifact that simply says, non-artifact spells you cast have Improvise. So if we tap a clue, it can pay for a colorless ability in a casting cost of a card. For the common good, that's the X. So as long as we have Jaheira or Inspiring Statuary, for the common good can make a number of token copies of something equal to half of the tokens we control, and that's not including any of the mana that we have maybe laying around in lands or creatures or anything else like that. So I think that this is a good highlight of how powerful that mana producing ability is for our tokens, and I think it's a great way to highlight cards like For the Common Good, because you don't typically think of this card in terms of clues or food. It typically gets seen more for creatures. But that brings us to the end of our cool interactions for today. And the final thing we're going to have to do for this deck tech is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week we came incredibly close to our budget limit of $100 at $99.59. And I do want to be perfectly honest, I do believe that the price may have creeped up even more lately, because our most expensive card in the deck is Tamiyo Inquisitive Student and the backside Tamiyo Seasoned Scholar at a massive $38.25. Now, when I put this card in here, it was not nearly this expensive. Unfortunately, seeing a lot of modern play, it has started to creep up. I'm hoping that this means that the deck can stay under 100, but if it keeps creeping up, then I imagine it'll break 100 soon. So if that is a concern and you do want to keep the deck, you can very easily cut Tamiyo and trim the deck price down pretty significantly. However, if you get the chance to keep her in, I do recommend it, because as I'm going to do my best to read through this whole card, she is very powerful in clue strategies. So she is 1 blue for the front side for a 0/3 Moonfolk Wizard. She has flying, and whenever she attacks, you investigate. When you draw your third card in a turn, exile Tamiyo and return her to the battlefield transformed. Very simple for us to do. We have a ton of clues and can draw a ton of cards. And when she transforms, she comes in as Tamiyo Seasoned Scholar with 2 loyalty. She has a +2 ability. Until your next turn, whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -1/-0 until the end of turn. She also has a -3 ability. Return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. If it's a green card, add 1 mana of any color. Then a -7, draw cards equal to half the number of cards in your library rounded up. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. So this is kind of the big payoff, being that -7, and while the +2 and -3 are not bad abilities, they're probably not going to win us the game. As weird as it is, we kind of just want Tamiyo for the front side. Being able to attack and investigate is a very powerful ability, especially when we can get it going as early as turn 1, and therefore start generating clues as early as turn 2. Overall, I think that Tamiyo, like I said, is worth the inclusion, but she is a very expensive card, especially, like I said, due to her modern play. So if you do need to trim the cost of the deck price, then she would be the easy cut, and there are plenty of clue cards that I did not include into the deck. If you see what we did there, they were not included. I'm sure some of my Discord's going to get me for that one, but I had to mention it. So feel free to cut it. If you are, though, on the other hand, looking for a card to include in the deck that is a little bit outside of our budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And this week, if you're looking for an out-of-budget upgrade, I would recommend putting in 20-Toed Toad and taking out Briar Bridge Tracker. So 20-Toed Toad is another alternate win condition that doesn't rely necessarily on combat, but it also doesn't rely on us drawing our entire deck, just, a lot of it. Because it is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 Frog Wizard. Your maximum hand size is 20. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, put a +1/+1 counter on 20-Toed Toad and draw a card. Then, whenever 20-Toed Toad attacks, you win the game if there are 20 or more counters on it, or you have 20 or more cards in hand. Because of the way that our deck functions, we're drawing a ton of cards, we're making a ton of mana. It is very likely that we can cast 20-Toed Toad, and then on our next turn, before we attack, draw up to 20 cards, attack with the Toad, and immediately win the game. Now, unfortunately, it is about $5.39, which isn't completely bank breaking, but because we were so close to our budget limit, it didn't quite make the cut. I chose to include Tameo over the Toad, so if you're looking for a cheaper version, then obviously Toad over Tameo, or if you want to keep Tameo, then the card I would recommend taking out is Briarbridge Tracker, which is 2 and a green for a 2/3 human scout. It has vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, investigate, and as long as you control a token, it gets +2/+0. So it's essentially a 3 mana 4/3 with vigilance because we're pretty much always going to have a token. But being that that's kind of all it does, plus investigating just a single time when it enters, means that it doesn't quite do as much as we would like it to do. And there's a lot more cards that we can put into this deck that can generate more tokens and produce more damage, or maybe even just more value. So I think that the Briarbridge Tracker, it's one of those cards that is good, but if we're looking at value, 20 Toad is going to be just a little bit better, and I think more efficient as the game goes on. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our deck tech, and before we get into a game, because of course we gotta get into a game with this deck, see how it actually performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, and of course shout out some of our current patrons and channel members. So if you're interested on joining us over on Patreon, you can find us patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, or right here on YouTube as a channel member. Activating either of those extra supports will get you a ton of things like access to deck lists a week early, access to a Discord where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear on the channel. Plus, it's just a great community. Honestly, I'm a big fan of everyone in there. I think we've created quite a fun community and quite a welcoming community. So if you're interested, please do check it out. And as always, a shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Huey, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Keegan Tawney, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, and the Oak Monster. So, thank you all so much for all of your support, and without any further ado, let's see who we're facing this week. As always, though, we are going to be joined by 3 opponents this week and test out our clue-making prowess. So, we are being joined by Captain America, First Avenger, which is being played by Bilal, Hua Tuo, Honored Physician, which is being played by Doodle, and Ayara, First of Lochthwain, being played by Vintage. So starting off with Captain America, this is Bilal's newest build. I think that he went pretty heavily into the equipment theme. I know he's been trying really hard to make every single new Marvel commander. We're going to see how well he can stick to that once the full Marvel sets come out. But I think that out of all of the new Marvel commanders that have come out, I think Captain America is one of the most concerning, because being able to just pay 3 mana to unattach an equipment and do a ton of damage means that he can just play these big equipment spells and just fling around a ton of damage, and I am a little concerned that it can just kind of keep killing our commander or some of our value pieces, so that is something to be aware of. I don't necessarily think it's going to be overwhelmingly powerful, but I think it's definitely powerful enough to keep an eye on. Moving on, we get to Doodle and his Hua Tuo deck, and this is going to be, as odd as it may sound, a mono green reanimator deck. There's quite a few cards in mono green that care about putting the top card of your library into play if it's a creature, so being able to use his commander to get a creature from his graveyard, put it on top of his library, and then put it from his library into play, making it a very odd and kind of convoluted mono green reanimator. But knowing Doodle and how good he is at building these unique reanimator style decks, I imagine this is going to have some very unique synergies and definitely some cards I haven't heard of, so it's definitely a deck that I want to be watching out for. Finally though, moving to our last opponent, the Ayara First of Lochthwain deck being played by Vintage. This is, for all intents and purposes, kind of a mono black good stuff kind of deck. He filled it with pretty much just all of the best cards that he has, and I imagine that the way that mono black plays, that's going to involve a lot of life loss. It's probably going to involve a lot of killing creatures and sacrificing. So I'm looking forward to this. I think Jaheira is a very fun commander and definitely one of those value engines that just can take over a game if you really let her. So we'll see how this goes. Let me know down in the comments which of these decks you might think is going to come out on top of this game. Get those predictions in. As always, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you all once this game is done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Doodle, and then Vintage. On my first turn, I play an island and cast Case of the Filched Falcon, investigating when it enters. Bilal plays a command tower and casts a Basilisk Collar. Doodle plays a Thespian Stage. Vintage plays a Swamp. I play a Forest. Bilal plays a Mountain. Doodle plays a Forest and casts Shigeki Jukai Visionary, which can be activated and returned to Doodle's hand to reveal the top 4 cards of his library and put a land from among them onto the battlefield, with the rest going into his graveyard. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts Timeret, Chosen from Death, which can be activated to exile 2 cards from a player's graveyard and gain Vintage a life for each creature exiled. Then, at the end of turn, I cast Secrets of the Key, investigating. On my turn, I play an island and cast Lannis Genetics Expert, which has Evolve, investigates whenever a counter is put on it, and puts a counter on another creature whenever I sacrifice a clue. Bilal plays a Clifftop Retreat and casts his commander, Captain America, First Avenger, letting Bilal attach an equipment he controls to him when he moves to combat, this time attaching Basilisk Collar to give Captain America lifelink and death touch. Then, Bilal can also pay 3 mana to unattach an equipment from him to do damage equal to that equipment's mana value, divided as he chooses among up to 3 targets. Doodle plays a Forest and casts a Finhorn Elves. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts his commander Jaheira, First of Loch Thwain, gaining a life and making each opponent lose a life whenever she or another black creature enters under his control. I cast my commander, Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, now letting my tokens tap for a green mana. This evolves Lannis, letting me investigate, and I cast a Disguise creature, then I play an Arid Archway, returning an island to my hand, and in my end step, since I control 3 artifacts, solve my Case of the Filched Falcon. Bilal plays an island and casts Sword of Hearth and Home, attaching it to Captain America when he moves to combat, giving him +2/+2, protection from green, protection from white, and when it deals combat damage to a player, letting him search his library for a basic land, exile a creature he controls, putting both into play under his control. This lets him attack me for 6 with Captain America, gaining 6 life, searching his library for a basic land, and putting it into play. Then at the end of turn, Doodle activates Shigeki, returning him to his hand, revealing the top 4 cards of his library, and putting a Forest into play under his control. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Forest and casts his commander, Hua Tuo, Honored Physician, which can tap to put target creature in his graveyard on top of his library, but only on his turn before attackers are declared. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts Feast on the Fallen, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature he controls in each upkeep, as long as an opponent lost life on the previous turn. He then attacks Bilal for 2 with Jaheira, and in my upkeep, since Bilal lost life last turn, Vintage puts a +1/+1 counter on Timeret. I then play an island and cast an Innocuous Researcher, which parlays when it attacks, letting me investigate for each non-land card revealed this way, and also letting me untap all my lands in my end step, but if I do, then I can't cast spells until my next turn. This also evolves Lannis, putting a counter on it, so I investigate. Then I attack Bilal with all of my creatures that can attack, undisguising Mistway Spy before damage, so I can investigate whenever a creature I control deals combat damage this turn. This means Bilal takes 6 while I investigate 3 times. Then, in my end step, I untap all my lands, meaning I can't cast spells until my next turn. Bilal cast a Sword of the Realms, attaching it to Captain America when he moves to combat, giving him +2/+0, and whenever it dies, returning Captain America to Bilal's hand. Notably, the sword should have fallen off since Captain America currently has protection from white, but after that, he attacks me for 8 with his commander. Before blocks, I sacrifice Case of the Filched Falcon to put 4 counters on a clue, turning it into a creature, letting me block, taking no damage, and sacrificing it to draw a card before the damage so Bilal doesn't gain any life. In Doodle's upkeep, he activates his commander, putting Bane of Progress from his graveyard on top of his library so he can draw it for turn. Then he plays a Bala Ged Sanctuary and casts the Bane of Progress, destroying all artifacts and enchantments, entering with a +1/+1 counter for each thing that it destroys. In response, Bilal activates Captain America, unattaching Sword of Hearth and Home to do 1 damage to Hua Tuo, Bane of Progress, and Jaheira, killing them all thanks to Death Touch, while Bilal gains 3. Still in response, I tap all my mana and tokens to sacrifice 3 clues, draw 3 cards, and put a +1/+1 counter on each of my creatures. Then the Bane resolves, destroying 8 permanents so it gets 8 +1/+1 counters. Vintage plays a Swamp, cast a Hedron Archive, and cast Dungeon Map, before attacking Doodle for 2 with Jaheira. I play a Forest and cast Peregrine Took, letting me make an extra food token whenever I would create 1 or more other tokens. I then attack Vintage for 3, Doodle for 3, and Bilal for 5. On attacks, we all parlay, revealing the top card of our libraries, putting it into our hands. Then I investigate for each non-land revealed, this time investigating 4 times and making a food token. In my second main phase, I cast Weirding Wood, enchanting an island so it can tap for 2 mana. It also investigates when I enter, so I make a food token as well. Bilal casts Ram Senior Edificer, letting him draw a card whenever he casts an aura, equipment, or vehicle, then cast Whisper Silk Cloak, drawing a card and attaching it to Captain America when he moves to combat, giving his commander Shroud and Unblockable. Doodle plays a Forest, recast Shigeki, and then recast his commander Hua Tuo. Vintage plays a Swamp, casts a Soul Ring, and then transmutes Dimir Houseguard, discarding it and searching his library for a card with mana value 4, specifically Sheoldred the Apocalypse, putting it into his hand, and then casting the Sheoldred, making each opponent lose a life, gaining a life, and now gaining 2 life whenever he draws a card, and making an opponent lose 2 life whenever they draw a card. When I draw for my turn, I lose 2, then I recast my commander Jaheira, once again letting my tokens tap for green mana, and letting me cast Adrix and Nev Twincasters, doubling the amount of tokens that I would create. I move to combat and attack Vintage for 8 with the Mistway Spy and Innocuous Researcher, making each player parlay, revealing 1 non-land, making 2 clues and 2 food tokens. Thanks to Sheoldred, this also means Vintage gains 2 and each of his opponents lose 2. In my second main phase, I cast Transmutation Font, which can tap to create a blood, clue, or food token. I also play a Gilda's Commons, returning a forest to my hand. Then, in my end step, I untap all my lands, meaning I can't cast spells until my next turn. When Bilal draws for turn, he loses 2, then casts Leyline Axe, discarding a card and losing 2 more life. He also plays a Stormcarved Coast, and when he moves to combat, Bilal attaches Leyline Axe to Captain America, giving him +1/+1, Double Strike, and Trample, letting him attack Vintage for 10. In Doodle's upkeep, he activates Shigeki, returning him to hand, revealing the top 4 cards of his library, putting a forest into play tapped from among them, and the rest into his graveyard. Still in his upkeep, Doodle activates his commander to put Bane of Progress back on top of his library, drawing it for turn and losing 2. After that resolves, Doodle casts the Bane of Progress, destroying all artifacts and enchantments when it enters. In response, Bilal activates Captain America, unattaching the leyline axe to do 4 damage to Jaheira, killing her. Still in response to the Bane of Progress, I activate Transmutation Font to make 2 clue tokens, also making 2 food. Then I tap all my mana and as many tokens as possible to sacrifice a total of 6 clues, draw 6 cards, lose 12 life, and put 6 +1/+1 counters divided among my creatures. With my remaining mana, I sacrifice 2 food token to gain back 6 of the life that I lost. Finally, the Bane resolves and gets 13 +1/+1 counters. When Vintage draws for turn, he gains 2, plays a swamp, and casts Dark Star Augur with Offspring, creating a 1/1 token copy of it when it enters the battlefield, now revealing the top card of his library in his upkeep, losing life equal to its mana value, and putting it into his hand. When I draw for turn, I lose 2, play an island, and cast World Walker Helm, now letting me create an additional map token whenever I create 1 or more artifact tokens, and I can tap it to make a token copy of another artifact token I control. When I go to combat, I attack Doodle for 5 with Mistway Spy, and attack Vintage for 7 with Innocuous Researcher, making each player parlay, revealing 2 non-land cards, letting me make 4 clue tokens, 2 food tokens, and 2 map tokens. Then Vintage gains 2 life, and each of his opponents lose 2 life, before Vintage blocks with his copy of the Augur, killing it and taking no damage, while Doodle takes 5. When Bilal draws for turn, he loses 2, plays a Plains, and casts Coalition Relic, followed by casting Sword of War and Peace, drawing a card, losing 2 life, and automatically attaching it to Captain America when he moves to combat, giving his commander +2/+2, protection from red and from white, and when it deals combat damage to a player, doing damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand, and letting Bilal gain life equal to the number of cards in his. When Doodle draws for his turn, he loses 2, plays a forest, and casts my least favorite card in the entire game, Spore Frog, which can sacrifice itself to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Once that's resolved, he casts Call of the Wild, letting him pay 4 mana to reveal the top card of his library, putting into play if it's a creature, or into his graveyard if it's not. This lets him activate his commander to put Hornet Queen from his graveyard on top of his library, and activate Call of the Wild, putting the Hornet Queen into play, making 4 1/1 insect tokens with flying and death touch. Finally, he recasts Shigeki, and moves to combat, attacking me for 13 with Bane of Progress. I block with Lannis, killing it and taking no damage. In Vintage's upkeep, he reveals Gothmog Morgul Lieutenant, losing 4 life, then draws for turn and gains 2. He plays a Field of the Dead and recasts his commander Jaheira, making each opponent lose a life while Vintage gains a life. After that, he casts Knight of Dusk's Shadow, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life, and notably, the Knight now prevents his opponents from gaining life, so before it resolves, I sacrifice 2 food tokens to gain 6 life. Then at the end of turn, I cast Deduce to draw a card, lose 2, and Investigate, also activating World Walker's Helm to make a copy of one of my clues, meaning I make a total of 4 clues, 4 food, and 4 maps. When I draw for turn, I lose 2, play an island, and attack Vintage with Innocuous Researcher, making each player parlay, revealing 2 non-lands, so I make 4 clues, 2 food, and 2 maps, while Vintage gains 2 life and all of his opponents lose 2 life. In my second main phase, I cast 500 Year Diary, which can tap for a blue mana equal to the number of clues I control. At the end of turn, Bilal activates Coalition Relic, putting a charge counter on it, and also cast Archivist of Ogma, letting him gain a life and draw a card whenever an opponent searches their library. When Bilal draws for turn, he loses 2 life and removes the counter from Coalition Relic. This lets him cast Kaikar Wind's Fury, letting him make a 1/1 spirit token whenever he casts a non-creature spell, and he can also sacrifice a spirit to make a red mana. Once that resolves, he casts Sword of Fire and Ice, making a spirit, drawing a card, losing 2 life, and attaching the sword to Captain America as he moves to combat, giving him +2/+2, protection from red and from blue, and letting Bilal draw a card and do 2 damage to any target whenever his commander deals combat damage to an opponent. In Doodle's upkeep, he activates Hua Tuo to put Verdant Force from his graveyard on top of his library, then activates Call of the Wild to put it into play, now letting him make a 1/1 Saproling token in each player's upkeep. Then he draws for his turn and loses 2 life, and activates Shigeki, returning it to his hand, revealing the top 4 cards of his library, putting a forest into play tapped from among them, and the rest into his graveyard. He then plays a forest and recasts Shigeki, and finally casts Brawn before moving to combat and attacking Vintage for 13 with the Bane of Progress. Vintage blocks with the Darkstar Augur, sacrificing it with Ayara, drawing a card, gaining 2 life, and taking no damage. When Vintage draws for his turn, he gains 2, plays a swamp, and casts Dusk Mangler, discarding a card to cast it. When it enters, he gains a life, makes each opponent lose a life, then forces each opponent to discard a card, lose 4 life, and sacrifice a creature, killing my Mistway Spy, Bilal's Archivist, and Doodle's Saproling that he just made this turn. Once all of that has resolved, Vintage casts Persistent Specimen, gaining a life and making each opponent lose a life. At the end of turn, I cast Whir of Invention for X = 7, searching my library for an artifact with mana value 7 or less, putting it into play. This lets me get Tangle Trove Kelp, making my other clues become a 6/6 plant creature in addition to their other types in the beginning of each combat. When I draw for my turn, I lose 2, then cast Forensic Gadgeteer, letting me investigate whenever I cast an artifact spell and making my artifact abilities cost 1 less to activate. When I move to combat, all 12 of my clues become 6/6 plant creatures, but unfortunately, before I can attack, Doodle sacrifices his evil Spore Frog to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. This means I only attack him with Innocuous Researcher for 0, making each player parlay, revealing 2 non-lands, so I make 4 clues, 2 food, and 2 maps, while Vintage gains 2 life, and each of his opponents lose 2 life. In my second main phase, I play a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1. When Bilal draws for his turn, he loses 2 life, then plays a Prairie Stream, and casts Excalibur for free since the total mana value of his historic permanents that he controls is greater than 12, drawing a card, losing 2, and making a spirit token. He equips it to Captain America, giving his commander +10/+0, but more importantly, letting him activate Captain America to unequip Excalibur, doing 6 damage to Doodle, putting him to 1, and 6 damage to me. I figure that since I'm dead anyway, I may as well go out on my own terms, sacrificing every clue I control to draw a grand total of 14 cards, putting 14 Sheoldred triggers on the stack. Since I still have mana available, I cast Confront the Unknown, investigating, making 2 clues, 2 food, and 2 maps, giving target creature +1/+1 for each clue I control, so I jokingly give Bilal's Kaikar +2/+2. Finally, I run out of options, passing priority, losing 32 life from Sheoldred, and being knocked out of the game. After all of that, Bilal re-equips Excalibur to Captain America, again unattaching it to do 1 damage to Doodle, knocking him out of the game, and 11 to Vintage. Finally, Bilal re-equips Excalibur to Kaikar, giving him +10/+0. This lets Bilal attack Vintage for exactly 16 damage with Kaikar and a Spirit, unfortunately only having lethal thanks to me jokingly casting Confront the Unknown, knocking Vintage out, and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We definitely got the chance to pop off with our deck, and I think that we really could have won if, of course, it weren't for Doodle playing, the worst card in all of Magic, Spore Frog. I know I keep kind of harping on that one, but it really is, it's just an awful card. I absolutely hate it. It is my least favorite card in the game. And really because of what we just saw in this game, we had a pretty clear way to win the game. We had a ton of power on board, and we just couldn't do anything about it because of a 1-mana 1/1 frog. So not to say that he shouldn't have played it, because he definitely should have. It was the right call. It really put us in a bind. But I think that we fell into trouble both with that and with the Sheoldred being in play. Since our deck really revolved around drawing cards, it really hurt to take 2 damage every single time we drew a card. And I think that if that wasn't something we had to worry about, I think we probably could have found a workaround, gotten around the Spore Frog, gotten around the combat tricks. But it definitely put us in a bind to both be losing life for just kind of doing our game plan and then not being able to activate our win condition. So definitely a concern there, but other than that, I think the deck performed incredibly well. And I don't normally do this, but I do want to highlight that if you are interested in seeing more of this deck, I do intend on putting up an unedited gameplay of it this coming Monday, so please do keep an eye out for that. But it was a game where we tried to get 4 players and our 4th player unfortunately had to drop. So it's only a 3-player game, so I didn't want to include it as the main game for the video. But I still wanted to show it off because I think it was a ton of fun and, you know, I recorded it, so I might as well use it, right? So check that out this upcoming Monday if you're interested in more. Otherwise, talking about the rest of the table, we'll go counterclockwise so we can end with our winner. But Vintage and his mono black Ayara deck did kind of what I expected it to do. It was a lot of kill spells and draw cards and sacrifice things. And it was kind of interesting how much Sheoldred played a role in that game. I think that her hitting the board as early as she did really put the whole table on notice because we had to play around it in ways that none of us were really expecting, which I think adds a little bit of a fun mini game aspect to it, but it also kind of highlights just how powerful that Sheoldred is and how much the game really does warp around her. Moving on to Doodle and his mono green Reanimator. His deck was super sweet to see. It was very cool to see some of the synergies he had of being able to mill some creatures or find some other ways to get them into the graveyard, mainly with something like Shigeki, and then getting them back with Huatuo, and then being able to just kind of keep getting these value creatures and these giant monsters for significantly cheaper than he may have been able to otherwise. So very, very sweet. Hopefully we do get to see this deck again in the future. And then last but not least, our winner, Bilal, with his Captain America deck. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, when he dropped Excalibur, I was kind of thinking, oh, that's kind of neat. I didn't expect it to do what it did. And then he was just able to fling around like 24 points of damage, knock a couple people out. And I do also want to apologize to pretty much everyone for essentially giving Bilal the win. I didn't expect when I cast my final spell of the game that I was going to be putting him in a lethal position to take Vintage out and win. I thought, I'm dying. I'm just going to hit a creature with it. It'll be funny, you know. And I didn't expect it to actually make an impact on the game. So I would be interested in knowing what would have happened if he hadn't been able to take out Vintage that turn. And obviously, we'll never know. It's still a victory for Bilal, so obviously congratulations to him. But it is something to pay attention to, so I would love to hear people's thoughts in the comments of, should I have targeted Kaikar? I mean, obviously there's no way for me to know, but I would love to hear people's thoughts and opinions on that one because it obviously played a very big role in the end of the game. So overall, thank you all so much for watching. Please do let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos. As always, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.